Well, hello, this is Tom Berry, your instructor for Soc201. This is the first installment for the term, providing a video for the week's assignment, some content, getting you prepared for the week's work. Let me just talk a little bit about the review and exploration assignments real quick before we get into the content part. There is a document in Blackboard on review and exploration assignment requirements. Definitely look that over. Kind of just walks through some different things to focus on and be thinking about as you approach the writing. And then one thing I want to highlight is expressing things in your own words. So if there's a section that requires you to define, explain, or anything that's bringing content in, right, into the assignment, is always use your own words. There should never be a case where you need to quote something from a book. From the textbook or another source. If you do so, though, make sure you use quotation marks and a source citation. I'm more interested in your own expression, your own way of explaining versus just a repetition right from a book. So be thorough in your defining, explaining. The more thorough you are, the more clear you are in defining and explaining, the more successful you will be. Okay, so for this week's assignment, kind of walk through the different sections. The content review section, the first issue or the first area is looking at Durkheim and Durkheim's explanation of social facts and suicide. Let me kind of give you a little bit of background about sociology as a discipline. And it goes way back in terms of historically. We could go back to ancient Greece, go to Aristotle, Plato, go to the Far East and talk about Confucianism or Confucius and sort of thought and ideas about society and social organization. Go to 14th century Mideast, an Islamic scholar, Khaldun, who kind of theorized a lot of stuff on demography, the study of people and population. But it's really in the 1800s, I think, where a lot of people mark the beginning of sociology as an academic discipline. And Auguste Comte was the one who kind of advanced that idea. He defined sociology as social physics, which I've always kind of thought that was a fascinating way to think about it. Is basically, it's a time period of the Enlightenment. People in academia are thinking, or of intellectual thought are thinking that they could systematically understand the world, that there are laws governing the world, and their job was to identify the laws that are governing societies. I think we've moved way beyond that. We don't have that same perspective anymore, but that was sort of why Auguste Comte identified it as social physics, this sort of idea of determining laws of society. I think we definitely look for well, never mind about that. So Durkheim was another kind of key figure in early sociology. He framed kind of the methods of sociology, the approach of sociology, and he's the sort of at the head of the functionalist perspective, structural functionalism. So the concept of social facts that he focused on, I've always appreciated his idea of social facts. And social facts basically are things external to the self that shape the individual, their experience, and their response to the world. So think about social facts as being influences. Okay, so if you look at suicide, was one of his things that he studied. He studied suicide and religion and institutions. He studied a lot of different aspects of society itself, all of them looking for and trying to examine what are those social forces that are going on that are shaping the human experience. So look at the number of kids. So if somebody, well, two different issues. One, if somebody decides to get married or not, or what is the age of first marriage. In the United States today, as well as most developed countries, is that people are waiting longer and longer to get married. I think the average age of first marriage now for male is 28, for female 20, 24, 25. And so we have this gender difference, number one. Number two, the age has increased significantly since like 1950s or even going back a little bit earlier. 1950s was actually historic lows or a really low time period. Age of first marriage was relatively low. Well, why is that, right? So it's not just individual choices, it's individual choices within a particular context. It's historical context, social context, economic context, and all these different kind of things. So one reason why people got married, 1950s, got married at a fairly young age, 19 and 17, for males and females, was that, the way the economy was structured in that time period is post-World War II. You have sort of the impact of the war itself. You have a lot of different social and economic factors that are driving that. It's the development of suburbia as well. There's sort of new lifestyle for the middle class. And there's a lot of gender stuff that's going on that's kind of shaping that as well. So those are all social facts, so sort of external forces. And I think the amazing thing to look at suicide through that particular lens is that oftentimes we think about suicide only through an individual lens. We think about the emotional state, the psychological state of the individual who may have taken their life. And we don't think about necessarily about the social forces that maybe that individuals encounter, right? So we look for what Durkheim tried to identify things like, well, does it matter a person's religious background? And he's absolutely, that Catholics much less likely to commit suicide than Protestants. And then the next question is, well, why would that be? And Durkheim theorized that it had to do with the level of integration into a community. Protestant religions are much more of an individual relationship to God. With Catholic Church, it's much more communal oriented. And it's this issue of integration, this membership into community, that if you have a high enough degree of integration, a sense of belonging and membership, you're less likely to commit suicide. And then the other issue for Durkheim is an issue of regulation, how highly or lowly regulated people were. So think about regulation as somebody kind of giving direction. Or if you step out of bounds, what happens? What's the response if you step outside of the norm, or what's required, and sort of how are you regulated? How are you being responded to by others or by society itself? For Durkheim, if you were over or under integrated or regulated, it created an increased likelihood for suicide. So that's kind of the general idea, but I wanted to kind of talk about that for a second to kind of give you a framework. Think about sociology as the systematic study of society. So we're looking at moving away from individual explanations, and we're moving into social explanations of institutions, all the way from institutions, macro level things, all the way down to group behavior, or in some ways you could look at individual behavior. But our focus in sociology is more about understanding patterns. It's about understanding patterns, it's about understanding institutions, it's about understanding sort of those social forces that are going on. All right, and then the next section is a section about the three sociological theories. Theories are different ways of explaining things, different ways of viewing the world. Theories are grounded in rational thought. There's a logic to theory, and there's research to support or to negate a theory. So the better the theory are the theories that are more supported through academic research, through just piles of information. It's like in class I talk about with students about theories are thinking about you're going to court, and you have there's something you're trying to a trial, and you're trying a case, and the case is looking at climate change, and let's look at climate change from these three different theoretical perspectives. Well, if you're a functionalist, you have certain tools, certain ways of thinking, certain ideas that you're after when you're looking at a particular phenomenon. So the job of a functionalist, or what a functionalist does, is basically it looks at that phenomena through that particular lens, and then collects information, data, gathers basically evidence to support or to argue for to what extent does the functionalist perspective apply, relate, these kind of things. So you have functionalism, conflict theory to also present its own case, and then interactionism would present its own case. These are three different theories, three different views, it's almost like lenses that you put on, glasses that you put on, three different ways of looking at the world. So sometimes they're in opposition to one another. Sometimes they overlap a little bit. All that's good. It's just different ways of thinking, different ways of approaching things. It's not that one is right or one is wrong. They're different analyses of the same thing. Now, having said that, it could be that in certain situations, like going into court, one theory definitely has more stronger proof. One theory, even though it approaches it different than this one over here, this one may actually be the more reasonable theory, the theory that explains more of what's going on. So in that section, read that article, The Three Sociological Perspectives. I think it's a great short read, and it gives you a nice sort of overview of what those three theories are. There's also a video put in Blackboard. There's a lot of videos that are out there on the three sociological perspectives. I really encourage you to get to know those, because we will use those throughout the course of the term. The next section is the Sociology of Empathy. And it's really important to talk about sort of this approach. We'll use it throughout the course of the term. The sociology of empathy is hard to kind of initially understand, but once you get it, it's like, oh, okay, I understand sort of the approach. Empathy, we oftentimes think about from an emotional place, like, I empathize with someone, I sympathize, right? There's this sort of affective component to empathy. And then there's cognitive empathy, and I'm more interested in us focusing on cognitive empathy, cognitive ways of thinking, knowledge. And so empathy is about understanding. It's about cognitive understanding. It's about awareness. It's about exposure. It's about experience. It's about ways of knowing about particular things. And the reason that that's important is sometimes that we live in, the social world that we live in, we develop ideas without ever having any contact with individuals that may occupy, a certain position, or we may never really read a lot about a particular phenomena. And in some ways, our biases start to shape, how we respond to the social world. And when we do that, sometimes there's significant consequences. We dehumanize individuals maybe in that process. We dehumanize ourselves when we do that. And when we start to get into public policy and social policy, sometimes when we're not developing an empathetic view, then we lead to policies that are actually very problematic. Empathy doesn't mean agreeing with a person's behavior, their actions, or whatever, or an institution. Empathy is about understanding. It's not about condoning. It's not about agreeing. It's not about whether I like it or dislike it. It's about understanding what motivates a particular situation. Sherlock Holmes, you can think about it if you know Sherlock Holmes, he is the quintessential empathizer because he has no affect. In fact, one way to think about this too is that when he's looking at a case, if he over sympathizes with someone, his emotions are sort of taking him, he's distracted now, and he cannot more clearly see what's going on in a particular situation. And that is difficult work. That is not easy because it requires being aware of what one's biases may be. It requires understanding sort of a person's emotional state to make sure it doesn't get in the way and again cloud sort of how a person approaches something. And we're talking a lot of stuff in this class, a lot of values and beliefs, stuff that relate to things that we address. If we look at something like poverty and anti-poverty programs, talking about the causes of poverty. It could be that I've never interacted, I'm going to take a particular aspect of poverty or demographic, and that's the homeless. I can have very strong ideas about the homeless, about people who are homeless, without ever having interacted with anyone who's homeless, without ever reading any research about homelessness, without really diving in and trying to understand or empathize cognitive awareness of that particular group. Now, I think it's fascinating to ask the question, well, why did I develop certain beliefs and ideas, certain biases, certain perspectives about a particular group, and not others? And I think now we're going to kind of get into the social world a lot as far as where do those influences come from? Why do we have those particular perspectives? Those aren't universal, or they haven't been that way all time. So the idea of empathy is really to break things down, to systematically understand. And I want to let you know it's a lifelong journey. It is not something that we're going to get accomplished. Like, I can do that in all cases at all times. It is a process, and it's a powerful one because I like to argue and talk about in my classes that empathy is not only about understanding others, it's about understanding self. And so when I dehumanize others, where I pass judgment on other groups without understanding sort of what's going on, with that particular population or individual, that has a lot to do with me as much as it has to do with the other person. So in a lot of ways, it dehumanizes us. So empathy is powerful because it provides us with a way of thinking to encourage more clarity of thought, more objective ways of knowing, and that's much more purposeful, much more helpful in so many different ways. And then finally is the last section, a couple TED Talks. Brian Stevenson, we need to talk about an injustice, and then Horowitz talking about philosophy in prison. Great videos. Hopefully enjoy them. I think they're pretty powerful sort of testaments to this idea of empathy, this idea of understanding, and then also just sort of the importance of awareness and education. And then the last sociological analysis is looking at happiness. It means going back to the social fact piece, right? we look at happiness, sometimes, we have in America, I think we're particularly prone to this. We think that, well, the individual creates his or their own happiness. Well, there's some extent that's true, right? We have some influence for sure, over our mental state. But to say it's only the individual creates his or their own happiness is a very limited, unrealistic perspective, right? So there's a lot of social forces that make that either more or less likely to happen. Go back to Durkheim and integration and regulation. If you're in a community where you're fairly well integrated, not overly integrated, like you have no sense of identity outside of the group, but you have a sense of place, a sense of purpose. We all seek that sort of sense of connection to others. Different people have different levels of need with that, but belonging and connection is really important for humans. And so when we feel belonging and membership into a group, it gives a sense of purpose, direction, and we are social beings, so we're connected to others. So it's levels of happiness are higher in communities where people are a little bit more well integrated. And so I encourage you to think about this idea of happiness, not from an individual perspective, but from a functionalist perspective, sort of some of these ideas. I'm not going to go through all of them because I want you to kind of scratch around and kind of to apply the theories yourself, but think about it from a functionalist viewpoint. Has a very particular way of thinking about happiness. Conflict theory, another one. It's going to be asking different questions about how societies are structured and its impact on people. And then interactionism, a third one, a different way of thinking about it. All right, so we're about 16 minutes. I don't want to occupy too much of your time. That's sort of an overview of the assignment, some content for the week. Have a great week. If you have any questions about the assignment, let me know. It's due Sunday by 11:59 p.m. I encourage you to finish it earlier. That way, if you run into any hiccups as far as submitting the assignment, you can get that taken care of. If you do run into some challenge, for some reason it's not submitting, make sure you email me before the deadline, and then we'll work with you to get it submitted and turn it in as soon as we can. Make that happen. All right, thanks for all you're doing. If you have any questions, let me know. Have yourself a great day.